The cough came before the wind did. Inside a shelter of hide and branches, a woman held her son against her chest and listened to the sound his lungs made in the cold. It was not yet the worst of the season. That was the part no one wanted to say out loud. Outside, an old woman stood at the edge of the village, looking at a slope of bare earth the way some people look at a debt they have not yet decided to pay. She had seen this kind of autumn before, not for many years, but she had seen it. The shelters built the previous season had done their work once. Everyone assumed they would do it again. The old woman was no longer certain of that, and certainly was not something she gave away easily. By the time the first hard frost arrived, 3 weeks earlier than anyone had prepared for, the argument had already started. Some wanted to reinforce what they had. Others wanted to wait and see. The old woman wanted to dig, not a cellar, not a pit for storage, a home, cut into the side of the hill, built from timber, willow, grass, and the kind of earth most people walked over without a second thought. Her son-in-law called it a step backward, a shelter for people who had given up on building upward, toward the sky, the way the strong ones did. He was not entirely wrong to be skeptical. What he did not yet know was how much that hillside was about to teach him, and how little time they had left to learn it. Her name was Witona, though the children called her grandmother, and by now most of the adults did too. She had counted close to 70 winters, though she herself had stopped counting somewhere around 60. What she remembered instead was the shape of things, the shape of a sky before snow, the shape of a wind that meant business. This wind meant business. 3 weeks before anyone expected it, frost had turned the grass along the river white and brittle, and the first hard freeze had cracked the surface of the shallow ponds. The corn that had not yet been harvested stood stiff in the fields, and the men who went out to bring it in came back with hands that would not stop shaking, though they blamed the wind and not the cold that had already found its way into their bones. Inside the lodge nearest the river, a young mother named Sahaspa sat with her son Ohanzi pressed against her side. He was 4 years old, small for his age, and the cough had started 2 nights earlier. It was not yet a dangerous cough. It was a kind that made a mother stop what she was doing and listen. Sahaspa's husband, Mapia, had built their summer shelter with care, the way his father had taught him. Poles lashed with rawhide, walls of woven branches, a covering of hide that had kept the rain out well enough in warmer months. It had never been tested against a hard frost this early, and now it did not need to be tested. It only needed to fail slowly enough for everyone to notice before it was too late. Witona walked the perimeter of the village that morning, not speaking to anyone, simply looking. She looked at the smoke rising thin and uneven from the shelters, at the way frost had gathered thickest where the wind came hardest, at the slope of the hill rising just beyond the last row of homes. She had seen this hill hold heat in ways the open ground never did, though she could not explain why in words the young men would accept. By midday, the council of families had gathered, and the question on everyone's mind was simple. What they had built would not carry them through a season like this one. What they needed, nobody wanted to say first. Witona said it for them. "We go into the hill," she said, "not to hide from winter, to outlast it." The silence that followed was not agreement. It was the kind of silence that comes before an argument. The argument came from her own family first, which made it harder to bear and easier to understand at the same time. Tokala, her son-in-law, was a strong man and a proud one, the kind who had built his own lodge with his own hands and expected it to answer for him. He had hunted through 4 winters without asking anyone for help, and the suggestion that his family should now dig into the earth like the older generation once had felt to him, like an insult wrapped inside good intentions. "We are not our grandparents," he said. "We build up toward the sky. That is how the strong villages have always built." Witona did not argue the point directly. She had learned, over many winters, that argue with pride rarely moved it. Instead, she asked him to walk with her to the hillside, And because he respected her even when he disagreed with her, he went. She pointed to the slope facing away from the open plain, sheltered from the worst of the prevailing wind by the rise of the land itself. She pointed to the low brush that still held green far later into the season in the grass on open ground, a small sign that the earth there kept its warmth differently. She had watched deer bed down against slopes like this one during hard winters, tucking themselves into the earth rather than standing exposed against it. "The deer are not ashamed to use the land," she said. "Only men worry about what a hillside says about their pride." Tokala said nothing to that. But that evening, the cough in his nephew's chest was louder than it had been the night before, and pride has a way of growing quiet around a sick child. Meanwhile, the shelters across the village were losing their fight in small, almost invisible ways. Wind found the gaps between hides and branches that had seemed sealed enough in the warmth of late summer. Cooking fires that once warmed an entire lodge now only warmed the air a few feet around them before the cold pulled the heat back out through walls that had never been built to hold a fire's warmth for long. An elder named Hachitu, who had outlived 2 wives and 3 of his own children, walked from lodge to lodge that night, checking on families the way he always did when the season turned hard. He did not say much. He did not need to. He simply touched the walls of each shelter, felt how quickly the warmth left his palm, and moved on to the next one with an expression that told its own story. By the time he reached Watona's fire, he sat down without being asked and said only, "How many hands do we have who are willing to dig before the ground freezes solid?" It was, in its own way, a kind of surrender, and it was the beginning of something else entirely. The decision to dig was not made all at once, and it was not made easily. It was made the way most difficult decisions are made on the frontier of survival, one uncomfortable conversation at a time, until the discomfort of doing nothing finally outweighed the discomfort of trying something unfamiliar. Watona gathered a few people in the village who remembered, even faintly, the old method her own grandmother had once described to her as a child. It was not a large group. Most of what she carried was not a finished plan, but fragments, images, half-remembered instructions passed down the way stories survive when no one writes them down. A circle scraped into the earth. Timber posts at the edge of it, leaning inward like the ribs of something enormous. A covering of woven branches, then grass, then earth itself, packed and layered until the structure looked less like a building and more like a part of the hillside that had simply decided to hollow itself out. "It will not look like a home," Tokala said, still not fully convinced, though he had stopped arguing against it outright. "It will not need to look like one," Watona answered. "It will only need to act like one." The first task was choosing the exact place to dig, and this alone took the better part of a day. Watona walked the slope repeatedly, testing the ground with a long stick, feeling for stone beneath the surface, checking how water pooled after morning frost melted in patches. She avoided low points where spring runoff would eventually gather. She avoided a section where the soil crumbled too loosely to hold its shape. She finally chose a spot roughly 40 paces from the base of the hill, angled so the entrance would face away from the wind that came hardest from the northwest. "Why does the direction matter so much?" asked a young man named Wapasha, who had volunteered his labor mostly because his mother had insisted. "Because wind is not shy," Watona told him. "It will come through any opening you give it, face the doorway from where it hits hardest, and you take away half its strength before it ever reaches your fire." It was not a complicated answer, but it was the kind of answer that made men who had spent their whole lives building upward stop and reconsider what they thought they already understood about shelter. By the second day, a shallow depression had been cut into the earth, roughly circular, wide enough to hold a family of 6 comfortably and a few more in a difficult season, if it came to that. It did not yet look like anything worth trusting a child's life to. It looked, if anything, like a wound in the hillside. Sahasapa stood at the edge of it that evening, Ohanzi asleep against her shoulder, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not confidence exactly. Something closer to the willingness to wait and see. Not everyone in the village was willing to wait and see, and the doubt that followed was not foolish doubt. It came from people who had good reasons to be cautious, and Witona respected that even when it frustrated her. An experienced hunter named Istaska, who had survived more hard winters than almost anyone else in the village, came to look at the excavation with open skepticism written across his face. "A den in the ground floods when the thaw comes," he said. "I have seen animal burrows drown in the spring more times than I can count. What happens to your home when the snow above it begins to melt?" It was a fair question, and Witona did not dismiss it. "That is why the floor sits above the lowest point of the cut," she said, "and why we will dig a shallow channel around the base, so water has somewhere to go besides through your bed." Istaska was not immediately satisfied. "And smoke. A fire needs to breathe. Bury a home in earth, and you bury the fire's air along with it." This, too, was a real concern, one that had likely doomed earlier attempts at this kind of shelter for people who had not thought carefully enough about where air needed to enter and where smoke needed to leave. Witona explained, as simply as she could, that the opening at the top of the structure would serve two purposes at once, allowing smoke to rise and escape, while a low-entrance tunnel allowed fresh air to enter near the floor, pulled naturally toward the fire by the same draft that carried smoke upward and out. "The fire creates its own wind if you give it two doors instead of one," she said. "One low, one high. It breathes through both." Istaska remained unconvinced, but he no longer argued against the attempt. He simply said he would wait to see it survive its first real storm before he trusted his own family to it, which was, in its own way, more respect than outright refusal would have shown. Other doubts came from quieter places. An older woman worried the structure would feel too much like a grave, too close to the earth in ways that unsettled her more than the cold did. A young father worried about digging through frozen ground if the work was not finished before the freeze deepened. Every doubt was, in some way, legitimate. None of them were answered with certainty. They were answered with effort, one layer of timber and grass and packed earth at a time. By the end of the fourth day, the frame of timber posts stood in place, leaning inward and lashed together at the center like the ribs of an animal turned inside out to face the sky. The construction itself demanded a kind of labor most of the village had not performed in years, if ever. Digging into half-frozen earth with tools made of bone, wood, and stone was slow work, and it asked something physical and exhausting from everyone who took part in it. Timber posts, cut from cottonwood along the riverbank, were set into ground at the outer edge of the excavated circle, then leaned inward until their tops met and crossed near the center, forming a rough dome-shaped skeleton over the pit below. Smaller poles were woven between the main posts, creating a lattice that would eventually hold the layers above it. Willow branches, still flexible enough to bend without snapping, were woven through the gaps, tightening the structure and closing many of the smaller openings before anything else was added. The smell of the work stayed with everyone who took part in it. Wet earth, crushed grass, the mineral scent of stone dust, sweat cooling too quickly in the autumn air. Wapasha, the young man who had questioned Witona earlier, found himself surprised by how much effort the structure demanded, and said as much one evening, his hands raw from hauling grass bundles up the slope. "My father always said a lodge above ground was harder work," he admitted. "I think he was wrong. Different work." Witona corrected him. "Not always harder, just different." Grass was laid in thick overlapping layers across the woven lattice, packed down by hand and by foot until it formed a dense mat that would help hold the earth above it in place and slow the passage of both water and cold. Then came the earth itself, cut in blocks from nearby ground and stacked much the way stone might be stacked, layer over layer, packed tightly enough that gaps became difficult to find by touch alone. Sahasrapa took part in this stage more than any other, in part because the physical effort gave her something to do with the fear she'd been carrying since the cough first started in her son's chest. She packed earth into place with the flat of a wooden paddle, again and again, until her shoulders ached and her hands were raw, and something about the repetition steadied her more than rest would have. By the time the outer shell was mostly complete, the structure no longer looked like a wound in the hillside. It looked like a hillside had simply grown a low, rounded shape, barely distinguishable from the slope around it except for the dark opening of the entrance tunnel and the small gap at the very top where smoke was meant to rise. It did not look impressive. It looked, if anything, unfinished. What no one yet knew was whether it would hold. The first real test came sooner than anyone wanted, and it came without warning. A heavy, wet snow arrived 9 days after construction began, falling faster and thicker than the early season usually allowed. It was not yet the deep cold of true winter, and the snow carried more moisture than the dry powder that would come later, which made it heavier than it looked, pressing down on every surface it settled across. By the second morning of the storm, a section of the roof near the rear of the structure had begun to sag visibly, a slow bowing inward that no one had noticed until Tokala, checking on the family inside, saw daylight where daylight should not have been able to reach. Then came the smoke. Instead of rising cleanly through the opening at the top, smoke from the cooking fire began curling back downward, spreading low across the floor, stinging eyes and catching in throats. Ohanzi, already weakened by his cough, began coughing harder, and Sahasapa scooped him up and carried him out through the entrance tunnel into the cold, choosing frost over smoke without a moment's hesitation. Outside, Witona stood in the falling snow, studying the sagging roofline with an expression that held more calculation than panic. "The weight is uneven," she said, mostly to herself. "It is pulling toward the low side." Tokala, no longer skeptical so much as frightened, asked the question everyone wanted answered. "Does it hold or does it fall?" "It holds for now," Witona said, "but we did not brace the rear posts as heavily as the front. I wanted this to work quickly. I did not make it work correctly. It was, in its own way, a remarkable thing for a respected elder to say plainly in front of a young man who had doubted her from the beginning. She did not defend the mistake. She named it the smoke problem. She realized after crouching low near the entrance tunnel to study the airflow was connected to the same weakness. As the rear of the roof sagged, it had narrowed the angle of the smoke opening at the top just enough to disrupt the draft that should have carried smoke upward and away. A structure that breathed properly through 2 openings had, in one section, begun breathing through only one, and imperfectly at that. That night, the family slept in a neighboring lodge, crowded but dry, while Witona sat by a small fire outside the earth shelter, watching snow gather on its rounded surface, thinking through what needed to change before the next storm arrived. Failure, she had learned across many winters, was rarely the end of an idea. It was simply the idea telling you, plainly, what it still needed. By morning, the snow had eased, and Wedinace, along with Tokala and 2 other men, began the work of understanding exactly what had gone wrong before attempting to fix it. They cleared snow from the roof carefully, section by section, and found what Witona had suspected. The rear support posts, set slightly shallower than ones at the front, had shifted under the combined weight of packed earth and wet snow, tilting just enough to change the angle of the entire rear section. It was a small difference in measurement, no more than the width of a hand, but it had been enough to throw the whole structure slightly out of balance. "We measured by eye," Tokala admitted. "We should have measured by comparison, post to post, not just guess that they matched closely enough." It was the first time he had used the word "we" when speaking about the structure, and Witona noticed, though she said nothing about it directly, the repair required resetting the rear posts deeper into the ground, this time using a length of braided cord stretched between each post and its neighbor to check that the height and angle matched consistently around the entire circle. It was slower work than the original construction had been, careful in a way that came from having already failed once, and not want to fail the same way twice. The smoke opening at the top was also widened slightly and reshaped, angled to catch the prevailing wind in a way that would help pull smoke upward rather than allowing it to hesitate at the opening. Witona tested this by feeding a thin trail of smoke from a small fire and watching how it moved, adjusting the shape of the opening twice more before she was satisfied with how cleanly it drew air through. Istaska, the hunter who had first raised concerns about smoke and flooding, returned to examine the repairs with the same skeptical eye he had used before. This time, he crouched inside the tunnel entrance for a long while, feeling the air move past him, before finally speaking. "The draft is honest now," he said. It was from him, close to praise. The channel around the base of the structure, meant to direct meltwater away from the entrance, was also deepened, since the recent snow had shown exactly where water tended to gather once it began to run. By the end of the third day of repairs, the structure looked much the same from the outside as it had before the failure. But everyone who had taken part in fixing it understood that what stood now was fundamentally more sound than what had stood before the storm exposed its weakness. The hillside had not rejected the idea. It had simply demanded more precision than the first attempt had offered. The real test did not wait long to arrive. Less than 2 weeks after the repairs were finished, the sky over the village turned the color of old ash, and the wind shifted direction twice within a single afternoon before settling into a hard, steady push from the northwest. Witona recognized the pattern immediately, and she did not wait for anyone's permission to begin preparing. "This is not a storm that passes in a night," she told the families gathered near her fire. "This is a storm that settles in and stays." She was right. The blizzard that followed lasted the better part of 4 days, burying the village under snow deep enough to make walking between shelters a genuine effort, with wind strong enough to strip the breath from anyone foolish enough to face it directly for more than a few moments. Inside the Earth Lodge, the difference was immediate and, for those who had doubted the project, difficult to argue with. While wind screamed across the open ground above, the interior of the shelter remained still, almost silent, the heavy earth walls absorbing the force of the storm rather than fighting against it directly. The cooking fire burned steadily, its smoke drawing cleanly upward and out through the repaired opening, and the air near the floor stayed warm enough that no one needed to huddle beneath every blanket they owned simply to keep their hands from going numb. O'Hansy's cough, which had worsened briefly during the cold, dry days before the storm, began to ease inside the warmer, more stable air of the shelter. Sahasapa noticed it first on the second night, the long stretches between coughs, the way his breathing settled into something closer to ordinary sleep. Outside, conditions worsened. Snow drifted against the above-ground lodges hard enough to bow their walls inward in places, and 2 families abandoned their shelters entirely on the third night, making the difficult, wind-blasted journey to the Earth Lodge, where there was room enough, if barely, to take them in. Tokala, who had once called the whole project a step backward, spent much of the third night awake, watching the small fire, listening to the wind fail to find its way inside the way it had found its way into every above-ground shelter in the village. He did not say much. He did not need to. By the 4th day, when the wind finally began to ease and the snow slowed to something closer to ordinary falling, the Earth Lodge had done what it had been built to do. It had not defeated the storm. It had simply refused to let the storm defeat the people inside it. Even after 4 days, no one inside the shelter slept easily on that final night, because the storm's ending did not announce itself clearly. The wind quieted gradually rather than all at once, and for hours it remained uncertain whether the calm was real or simply a pause before the weather turned again. O'Hansy's breathing, which had steadied through most of the storm, grew shallow and uneven again sometime after midnight, and Sahasapa sat upright with him against her chest for the remainder of the night, counting each breath the way a person counts something they are afraid to stop counting. Witona sat near the fire, feeding it small amount of wood at careful intervals, watching the smoke rise clean and steady through the opening above, and watching Sahasapa in the low firelight without saying much. There was nothing left to build, nothing left to repair. There was only waiting. And waiting has always been the hardest part of any solution, however well designed. Near dawn, Ohanzi's breathing settled again, this time more fully, and he slept through the last hour of darkness without the small catches and struggles that had marked the night before. When the first gray light reached the smoke opening above, Sahasapa finally allowed herself to lay him down and rest her own eyes, if only for a short while. Outside, the scene that greeted the village when people finally emerged from their shelters told its own story without needing to be explained. The above-ground lodges stood damaged, several partially collapsed under the weight of drifted snow, their walls torn in places where the wind had found gaps that grew wider with each passing hour of the storm. Families who had sheltered there stood among the wreckage of their own homes, cold, exhausted, and mostly silent. The Earth Lodge stood largely unchanged from how it had looked before the storm began, its rounded shape barely visible beneath a heavy blanket of undisturbed snow, smoke still rising thin and steady from its opening at the top. Istaska, the hunter who had questioned everything about the project from the beginning, walked the perimeter of the structure slowly, running his hand along the snow-covered earth, saying nothing for a long while. Finally, he turned to Atona, who stood watching him with the same patient expression she had worn through every doubt raised against her over the previous weeks. "I did not think the ground could keep a family safer than the sky could," he said. "The ground was always willing," she answered. "It simply needed someone patient enough to ask it properly." Word of what happened during the storm spread through the village faster than any single person could have carried it, the way important news always seems to move on its own. Within days, 2 more families had begun marking out sites along the same hillside, choosing their locations with the same careful attention Watona had used, testing the ground, considering the direction of the wind, avoiding the low points where water would eventually gather. They came to her with questions, the same questions Tokala and Istaska had once asked with skepticism rather than curiosity. She answered patiently, correcting the small misunderstandings that inevitably arose, reminding each new builder that precision mattered more than speed. By the following spring, 5 earth lodges stood along that hillside, each one slightly different in size and shape, depending on the family it sheltered, but each one built on the same essential understanding, that a wall of earth, properly built, does not fight winter directly. It simply refuses to let winter in patiently, one layer at a time, and lets a small fire do the rest. Ohanzi grew stronger through that winter and the ones that followed, and by the time he was old enough to help with construction himself, the method that had once seemed like a step backward to men like Tokala had become simply the way the village built for the hardest part of the year. No one spoke of it as unusual anymore. It had become ordinary, in the way that good solutions eventually do, once enough winters have tested them and found them sound. Watona did not live to see every one of those winters, but the method she had carried forward from her own grandmother's half-remembered instructions did not disappear with her. It passed instead to Sahasapa, and eventually to Ohanzi himself, who would one day explain the same principles to his own children the way his mother had once heard them explained to her, standing at the edge of a hillside during a season that had arrived far too early and left far too much at stake. The village never forgot that particular blizzard, the one that had torn through their above-ground shelters and left their earth lodge nearly untouched beneath its blanket of snow. But what they remember most clearly in the years that followed was not the storm itself. It was the quiet of that shelter during the worst of it, the steady breathing of a child who had once struggled for every breath, the sound of wind failing, again and again, to find its way inside. The hillside had not saved them by magic. It had simply remembered something the village had, for a while, allowed itself to forget. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is a narrative reconstruction inspired by Earth Lodge building traditions among Plains Nations peoples, such as the Mandan and Hidatsa, who developed sophisticated underground and semi-underground dwellings suited to harsh prairie winters. Specific characters, names, and events in this account are fictional reconstructions created for storytelling purposes and are not documented historical records. This content is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.